Welcome back, metas. In the last video, we looked at the silent Anabasis, specifically whether you should build into crits, weak spot, or elemental damage. And while I was pretty happy with my mod recommendations, we did some min-maxing for the mods, and like usual, I have an Excel spreadsheet, work out the formulas, and try to give recommendations based on the math for each mod. But what I didn't do very well was actually look at the new armor, specifically for an elemental blueprint. So I got a lot of questions about, well, what about the new Blackstone armor set if you're making an elemental build? Because a lot of the calculations were using the shelterer set. And that is also for an elemental build. And now we have the Blackstone set. I severely underestimated this set, and there's a good reason why. During week one, I didn't realize there are two other variants for this set that you can't see in the blueprint section, and you can only see the cold and hot variants when you start crafting this set, and it's pretty good. So what I wanted to do today is min-max for your armor set combinations. What's the best armor set combinations you should use if you're running an elemental build? And of course, I will include the new Snow Camo gloves as well. There'll be chapter links down below. You'll be able to scrub through. If you don't want to see the explanations, you want to go straight to the results, you can skip to the results. Okay, let's talk about the Blackstone variants first and how it works. So the standard Blackstone set, you'll notice there is a replaceable part here with the Stardust source. So if you leave it on Stardust, you get what I call the standard set. So the first perk is cold and heat resist plus 2.5. And the next one is upon dealing elemental damage. So this would be from your vortex or even the explosion from the crystals. You gain 1 stack of warm sensation, which is 2% elemental damage for 2 seconds. And it can trigger every 0.5 seconds up to 5 stacks. So 5 times 2% gives you a total of 10% elemental damage from warm sensation. This is where it starts to get a little bit trickier to understand. It says when the temperature is between 10 and 30, you gain the warm status, elemental damage plus 18%. So this set is pretty much for ideal environments. I'm assuming when we move on to other scenarios where, I don't know if we're going to continue having maps that have cold and hot, but if they get rid of those extreme in temperatures, this is probably going to be the standard set that you use because you get the buffs in this like ideal range between 10 and 30 degrees. And when it's in that range, you get the elemental damage plus 18%. And then the final one is at 5 stacks of warm sensation. So that is perk number 2. So you do 5 lots of elemental damage. Each stack of elemental damage gives you 2% additional elemental damage. You can just stack it 5 times. So once you've got your full stacks on perk 2, and the temperature is between 10 and 30 degrees again, you get another additional elemental damage plus 7. This is all pretty basic. You're pretty much just doing elemental damage. You're getting more elemental damage, and then you've got some flat elemental damage buffs depending on the temperature. If you switch over to cold or hot rock, these perks completely change. And if you go on cold, it suits a cold environment, and you go on hot, it suits a hot environment. If you're new to the game or you're not in this scenario yet, there are certain places where you can farm this. I don't know exactly all the places, but I can just show you where I've been farming them if you need to get them easily. There is a cave under the Tundra monolith. I just go to this teleporter, jump off the cliff and fly around to the entrance, jump all the way down the bottom of the cave, and there's some cold rock there. And then there's also some hot rock up here as well. I just go to this teleporter here and just go straight across, and there'll be a cave around here. These caves seem to have a lot of the ore. You can just find them out and about in the areas as well. But if you want to find like a large concentration, that's where I go to get them. So if you replace it with the cold, you now get cold resist plus 5. So rather than it being cold and hot 2.5, you now just get all built into cold resistance. The first one is very similar. It's the second perk. Upon dealing elemental damage, you gain 1 stack. You can stack 5 times. This just gives you elemental damage plus 10%. Fine. This is where it starts getting a little bit harder to work out. So perk 3 says when the temperature is below 10 degrees Celsius, you gain cold status. So you get a flat elemental damage plus 10%. And then for every additional degree below that, gain elemental damage 0.5% up to 20%. So we can kind of show you this straight away. So if you have a look in the top right-hand corner, we are currently sitting on negative 15 degrees. We're going to look down here. Right, we're currently on negative 15 degrees. And the best way to do something like this is, or to visualize it. All right, this is our temperature scale. This is 0 degrees Celsius. This is 10 degrees. And we are currently sitting at negative 15 degrees. And so it said for every degree less than 10, we get, was it 0.5? We get 0.5 elemental damage. All right, so we have 10 degrees to 0, and then 15 degrees to negative 15. So we got a change of 25 degrees, and half of that is going to be 12.5. Right, so now we can see how that would stack up. So we're just going to have a look at the elemental damage. We're not going to look at Frost yet because Frost is getting buffed by some other things. But let's have a look at the elemental damage is 32.5. So we are getting the first flat elemental damage 10% just from it being below 10 degrees Celsius. Okay, so we're below 10 degrees Celsius. So we're getting plus 10 elemental damage just from being below 10 degrees Celsius. Then I do have some other things going on because of this season. We actually have a wide area radiation, which is giving us an elemental damage plus 10% because of our thermal tower. Okay, so we have another 10 elemental damage because of our tower. Okay, so now we're at a total of 20. Then we have the 12.5 that we're getting for the additional degrees below 10 degrees Celsius. So we have plus another 12.5. Right, and that's going to give us 10, 20, 32.5 degrees elemental damage just from standing here, being in the cold area. All right, and if we go back and have a look at our stats. Okay, the temperature's changed. It was 32.5. Right, this is a good example. Okay, now we're down to 5 degrees. Now we're on negative 5 degrees. Right, so we've actually just dropped down to that. So now the difference is 10 plus the 5. Now the difference is 15. So we're only getting half of that divided by 2, 7.5. So now we're getting 10, 20, 27.5 should be our elemental damage. Elemental damage is right there, 27.5. Now, the reason why our frost damage is 47.5 is because you remember back to our build video, Silent Anabasis gets a 20% buff to frost elemental damage. By the way, they patched this. This was completely incorrect last time, and now it's been patched, so it actually shows you the correct percentage. So yeah, that's why frost elemental damage is getting a buff by 20%. Cool. We're not quite finished yet because the last perk complicates things a little bit more again. Okay, so let's put cold on there. So the last perk says at 5 stacks of warm sensation. So you just do 5 instances of elemental damage and you get 5 stacks of warm sensation. The environment temperature drops by 20 degrees. The damage bonus provided by the cold status is doubled and its cap is increased to 40%. Okay. Let's just break this down line by line. The first thing says the environment temperature drops by 20 degrees. Yes. It actually drops by 20 degrees. So we're at let's have a look. We're at negative 5 degrees. If you look at the top right-hand corner. And when I get 5 instances of elemental damage, it's going to drop to negative 25. Okay, so as soon as we get 5 vortexes or 5 crystals shattering, there we go. Negative 25 degrees. The temperature actually drops. And you think, well, why do I want that? Well, remember, for every degree you're below 10, you're getting an elemental buff. But there's a little bit more to it. Let's go back to this. Put in the cold. So it drops the temperature by 20 degrees once we got 5 warm stacks. The damage provided by the cold status is doubled. So now rather than getting the elemental damage of 10%, you actually get 20% just for having this 4th stack once you have 5 stacks of warm sensation. And it also doubles, it's not quite clear, but it actually doubles this 0.5%. So before, every degree below 10, you were getting 0.5% of elemental damage. Now you get 1% of elemental damage, and it caps at 40. Now, every degree below 10 degrees, we're going to get 1% of elemental damage, and it's capped at 40. And remember, when we get 5 sensations, warm sensations, we're going to drop the temperature by 20 degrees. What you need to know, the breakpoint's basically -10. So if you're on -10 and you get 5 lots of warm sensation, it's going to drop your temperature down by 20 degrees. So you're going to go to -30. Okay, then the temperature's going to be -30 degrees. So the difference between that is we got 10 to 0, and then we got 30 to -30. So we have a total change of 40 degrees Celsius. And you get 1% for every degree below 10. So this is how you get your max stack of 40 elemental damage. So all you need to know is if it's -10 degrees or below, and you get your 5 stacks of warm sensation, you're gonna reach your max of 40 elemental damage. Pretty cool. Right, and the hot rock is exactly the same, but for warm temperatures. So you have heat resist instead of cold resist, and then the triggers for this is above 30 degrees rather than below 10 degrees. But everything else works out the same. You get the status is called something else. It's called passion status rather than cold status, but everything else functions the same. The only thing is the trigger point is now being above 30 degrees Celsius rather than below 10 degrees Celsius. Okay, let's do a general set comparison before we start mixing and matching and adding in uniques. So we've got the Blackstone cold or hot sets versus the Blackstone like standard set versus the shelterer set. Cool. The Blackstone cold and hot variant did the most damage. It did about 7 to 8% more damage than the standard Blackstone set, and it did about 6 to 7% more damage than the shelterer set. So right now, for this scenario, for the season, when you going into a cold area and you know it's going to be at least -10 degrees Celsius to get the max of all the perks, your Blackstone set is the best option. Now, if we take the changing weather out of the equation, let's say like a new season and we don't have extremes in temperature or something like that, and we start to gravitate towards the sort of standard Blackstone set versus the shelterer, what's the difference on those? So there was a less than 1% difference between these two sets. And you can see why, because their perks are very, very similar, like stat-wise. You've got a flat 8% here, you've got a 10% here, you've got a flat 18% here, you've got a 20% here. Right, so that's 28. That's also 28% elemental damage. And then you've got a flat 7% here, depending on the temperature. And then you've got another 10% here, right? So these are very close, like stat-wise, for how much elemental damage you are getting. And that's why the difference ends up only being 1%. Remember, like, we've got to add in your bullet damage, your crit damage, your weak spot damage, all that kind of stuff. So that's why it ends up being so close together. It really comes down to what is better at triggering. And I think for the Silent Anabasis, that the shelterer set is easier to trigger because it says each weapon hit grants 1 stack of deviant energy, and every stack of deviant energy gives you 1% elemental damage. And if you're hitting a weak spot, you're going to get actually 2 additional stacks. Now, that means at its very base form with only 3 perks, 2 bullets is going to give you 2% elemental damage. If we compare that to the trigger for the Blackstone, which is essentially you need 2 You need you need one instance of dealing elemental damage to get 2%. And remember, you've only got a 10% chance to trigger a vortex. So after the first 2 bullets, you've got 2% elemental damage with the Shelterer. Compare that to the Blackstone, you actually need to trigger a vortex, which is 10% on your, out of every bullet, might trigger a vortex to get this rolling. So I think it's easier to get the Shelterer buffs rolling than it is to get the Blackstone buffs rolling. That being said, if you compare it to perk 3, you get a flat 18% as long as you're in the temperature zone of 10 to 30. I think overall though, I think just take away that there's like a 1% difference and it all comes down to how quickly you can trigger it. And I am leaning towards the Shelterer hat, but feel free to correct me on that one if you think the Blackstone's got a bit of an advantage with triggering it's all its buffs. Okay, let's talk about uniques and then we'll mix everything together. As you likely learned from my previous video, I'm a huge fan of the Stealth Walker wrap. I think it has great synergy with Frost Vortex because it sucks enemies into an area. Then the Frost Vortex ticks, does damage. Also, it's got good synergy with the Crystal Explosions because all the enemies get sucked together and they blow up. Obviously, though, it's not very useful for any boss damage because it won't affect your bosses. It is useful for boss areas if there are ads around and you need to control ads, and especially like the raid where you get to the final phase and there's just so many small enemies running around. That's actually how I got through the hard mode, like a hard server raid was using this to control ads so my team could do more DPS. Personally, I think if you're choosing the Silent Anabasis, you're not trying to be the highest DPS, like you want some utility, and this is why I previously recommended Stealth Walker. But of course, let's just say you are just going for boss damage and you just want to min-max your boss damage. What are your other options? We have the Doyen's Cloak. When the frozen effect ends, deal frost damage equal to, I'm assuming that means 50% of the total damage you dealt during the frozen period. We also have the Frost Tactical Vest, which generates ice spikes. It does 100% psi intensity. And then we also have the Snow Camo Gloves, which is a new one, where when you shatter an ice crystal, you get 4 additional missiles. And the status damage is equal to 40% psi intensity to targets, and it changes for PvP. Cool. Now, the hard one to work out is this cloak here. And because it's really, really inconsistent, because you only have a 10% chance to spawn a Frost Vortex, and then if you spawn another Frost, you have a limit on how many Frost Vortexes you can spawn too. So if you spawn more than 2, one goes away and another one pops up. And technically you want your Frost Vortexes on the field for as long as possible, so you don't want to be overriding them, and you want to be doing as much damage as possible during that time. I found, and it's very hard mathematically to work that out because we just don't know how long those Frost Vortexes are going to be on the field. So what I just did is I took an average of 10, using this 10 times on the dummy, and I've just compared it to the Frost Tactical Vest because this is very consistent because it just does ice spikes of 100% psi intensity, and see which did more damage. The Frost Tactical Vest was consistently outperforming the Doyen's Cloak, so I'm not putting this into my rotation. So when we're min-maxing for boss damage, I'm going to put in the Frost Tactical and also put in the Snow Camo Gloves. Okay, let's have a look at how you can mix and match the different armor pieces for the best combinations. The first combination I tried was Snow Camo Gloves with 4 pieces for the Blackstone Cold variant set, or that could be the hot variant set, just one of the variants. And then 1 times a Bastille. The next combination I tried was 2 Savior pieces. Now the reason why I put this in here is when your second perk, once you've got 2 pieces for this, is you get weapon and status damage of plus 10% when your HP is above 70, which sounds pretty good for this build. So I tried 2 Savior pieces and then 4 Blackstone cold or hot variant. So that's like no unique, that combination. So you're sacrificing a unique slot, but you do need all 4 pieces of the Blackstone, and you do need 2 survivors, so you can't fit a unique in that build. Then I did 2 saviors, not survivors, 2 saviors, 3 standard Blackstone. The thing about the standard Blackstone is you can give up the last perk on Blackstone set, because the last perk is just giving you a flat 7% elemental. So if you actually get 2 saviors, you get weapon and status damage of 10%. So you actually start doing better with 2 saviors. So you can sacrifice the last tier on the Blackstone, do 2 saviors, 3 Blackstone, and then put 1 Bastille in there for your weapon damage. And then finally, I tested having the Frost Tactical with the 4 Blackstone, cold or hot variants, and then 1 Bastille. So what did the numbers look like? So the top performing combination was the Snow Camo combination. And if you think I've missed a combination, please let me know. Also remember that anything with the Blackstone sort of variant, the Blackstone standard can also be replaced with the Shelterer because they're very close in damage numbers. But the top performing was the Snow Camo combination, and the numbers looked a little bit like this. So compared to our set with no unique and the 2 saviors and the 4 Blackstones, it did between 5 to 6% more damage. Comparing it to our 2 saviors, standard Blackstone and Bastille, it did, it did quite a bit, 11 to 15% more damage. And compared to our Frost Tactical build, it only did 3% more damage. So even though on paper, Snow Camo feels like it should do a lot more, you have to remember that it's only every time you destroy crystals. So Frost Tactical is actually not a bad option to have as your unique if you don't want to waste the Star Crom. Pair it with the 4 bits of Blackstone, cold or hot variant, and your Bastille, and you're just doing some pretty decent damage. Now, when this scenario is over, depending what happens with the weather changes, like if we start losing the extremes in weather, it's going to make the Blackstone cold variants useless because we're not going to be below 10 degrees. And if that's the case, then you just sub that out. I think I'm leaning towards putting the Shelterer in there instead. I think I like how that triggers more than the Blackstone standard, but that's your other option too, is to put the Blackstone standard in there or your Shelterer in this spot here. And this combination does more than this one over here. So that's kind of why I would just replace those 4 Blackstone colds with 4 pieces of Shelterer. And you kind of need the full set of the Shelterer too to be really doing max damage. So that's what I'm going to do after this scenario is finished. While the scenario is still here, the Blackstone variants are really, really good. They're your top DPS. Snow Camo if you got the Star Crom, Frost Tactical if you don't. Go for it. And there you have it. Hope that it helps with organizing your armor combos for an elemental build. If this has been helpful, a like and a comment would be greatly appreciated. And I'll see you next time. Peace.